will proclaim the gospel, as we do sometimes, by enacting it with our own bodies. So today, to help me tell the story, I need Philip. I need the disciple named Philip. Someone come forward to play the part of Philip. Anyone can be Philip. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And Andrew, our own Saint Andrew. Yeah, thank you. Wonderful. This is a non-speaking part. No, sorry, yours is a speaking part. There's a non-speaking part, however, for a boy. I think today it could be a boy or a girl with who brought some food from home.
Oh.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you. And yes, we're definitely going to need also Jesus. Anyone can be Jesus?
We're waiting for it.
Yay! Thank you, Tom. And the rest of you get a part two. You're the crowd. And in the spirit of some of the songs we sang last week at Making Your Mark Camp, this is a repeat after me part. Hey, there we go. And a do as I do part.
Do as I do part.
Oh, that's good. Let's try over here. Yeah, everybody. And then over here.
Over here.
All right, that's like 90%. That's good. You'll be ready when the time comes. I'll give you your lines. Just like always when we share the gospel in this way, the words are the gospel. The story is the gospel. We're telling it with our own body. So I will give you your lines as your part comes along. All right. Let's see. Alice, can you come over here? Great. Maybe back up towards those chairs a little. Your part's going to come in a minute. Maybe all the way back to the chairs. Yep, good. All right, and come on over here, Jesus, with your disciples. All right. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to John.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
As the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was approaching, Jesus came round to the other side of Lake Galilee, along with his disciples, and went up a mountain. And sat down there, but for the purpose of theater, mostly in imagination only. Sat down there with his disciples. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. When Jesus looked up and saw the crowds, Jesus said to Philip, this one's Philip, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?
Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?
Jesus said this to test Philip, for he himself knew what he was about to do. Philip answered Jesus, 6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for all these people.
6 months' wages would not be enough to buy bread for all these people.
Now another disciple named Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, there is a girl here.
There is a girl here.
Who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
Who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish.
But what is that among all these people?
But what is that among all these people?
So then Jesus came around to it and said, make the people sit down.
Make the people sit down.
They did so. And they sat down, and there were about 5,000 of them in all. Then Jesus took the loaves from the girl. Here, bring those over to Jesus. And when Jesus had given thanks, Jesus distributed them to all those who were seated. So also the pieces of fish. As much as the people wanted. When the people were satisfied, Jesus told his disciples, now you gather up the fragments left over,
Now you gather up the fragments left over,
so that nothing may be lost.
so that nothing may be lost.
So the disciples gathered up the fragments. And from the fragments they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they began to say, this indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world. When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Oh, thank you, actors. Thank you. How do you think they all ate on the hillside that day?
That's the spiritual food?
That's the miracle. Russ?
I said spiritual food.
Spiritual food? Do we need to know why? Don't steal the whole sermon. I asked the same question of the people, the 12-year-olds, the 10-year-olds at art camp after we shared this story. And they said, maybe everyone just ate a little. Maybe everyone only took as much as they needed. Sharing. Some amount of magic is one of the answers. When we ask ourselves, how did all of those people get fed that day on the hillside? It puts us in the same posture of confusion as the disciples when Jesus turned to them and said, how are we going to feed all these people? So I think that's a good posture of confusion for us to be in. Jesus wanted us there. He knew what he was about to do, but he still asked that of Philip. And this sign of Jesus, to use John's word for it, it originally takes place in Mark's gospel, and John expands upon the narrative a little. He gives us those lines between Jesus and his disciples. Philip, where are we to buy bread for these people? Where are we to buy bread? Can we fix this with money? And Philip says, no, not with years of wages could we feed all these people. So then Andrew, our Andrew, he says, well, there's a boy here, there's a girl here with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So we do have something to work with, I've noticed. This is like a first forward movement out of the disciples. But what are they among so many people? How could this be enough? So that's when Jesus did what John calls a sign. And Jesus first gave thanks. For what they did have, he gave thanks to God. And distributing it to all the people until they all had something. Now, not just something, but as much as they wanted. And I wanted to ask, is there anything we do together that looks like this? What does this remind you of? And then you're going to say, the Eucharist. Communion, yeah! This, John, when John tells this feeding of the 5,000, he sets it at the time of the Passover. And it's the second of three Passover moments that John records in his gospel, building towards that Passover when Jesus gives us, when we have the Last Supper with Jesus, and Jesus gives us himself for all time in the bread and the wine. So John's community, as they told the story that way, they help us recognize this unity of all Jesus's works with us. How they're all brought together in the communion. And for the next 4 weeks, we get to be awash in John's bread of life discourse, so-called. For 4 weeks, we will be marinating in John talking about Jesus as the bread of life. You get a couple different preachers over that span, luckily enough. But hold on, because if the only thing we see in this feeding of the 5,000 is that it's like communion, then we haven't gotten everything that John has tried to give us by adding a little bit more to the story. John says that if Jesus' life is this one unified display of God's love, then this moment on the hill is not just like communion. Oh, that's sweet. Jesus said grace all the time. It's not just like communion, but this feeding on the hillside helps describe what communion is. When all the people were satisfied, so communion is about God filling our needs. Jesus told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. Like the parable of the lost sheep that the good shepherd goes out to find, like the parable of the prodigal son, here is an affirmation in the feeding that in communion, nothing should be lost to God. Even the stuff of the world. Gather up the fragments of the bread and of the fish. So they gathered them up from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who were eaten, and they filled 12 baskets. Communion is not just enough, communion is more than enough. So when you take this whole story, you get the foundation of an entire Christian relationship with resources. A whole theology of stuff, of resources in the whole world. This is, I know I say this all the time, you tell me when I'm past 10, but this is on my top 10 list. And let me take you back to the top of the passage now. A large crowd kept following Jesus because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. So John binds together Jesus' curing of the sick with the feeding, the sign of the feeding. So communion is also connected with healing. In the feeding of the 5,000, John is gathering up all these signs of Jesus, the same way that the disciples end up gathering up the barley loaves. So that by the end of the account, he tells us, when the people saw the sign that Jesus had done, they began to say, this indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world. When I read this story, I'm filled with many of the same confusions and possibilities and questions as you when I see that 5,000 people were fed on the hillside by Jesus. But Jesus seemed to be perfectly happy confusing us in this way, confusing our worldly expectations, so that with us brought up short, he could then introduce a teaching about the dream of God, about the real meaning of communion with God, with neighbor, and with the earth. And I recognize that as miraculous, as a sign. I found myself thinking, well, what would happen in my family? What would happen in my town? What would happen in my country if we baptized all of our worry about having enough into this story of the feeding of the 5,000? if we first let ourselves, as we were worried about having enough, what if we first let ourselves delight in the healing of the sick among us? And then, when we're hungry, when we desire, noticing what we already do have to hand. And then humbly taking what we've found that we do already have and giving thanks to God for it. Listening to notice at what point my needs have been satisfied. And when I've reached that mark of satisfaction, to pause and accept my fullness. Or notice how the disciples and Jesus, even while still hungry themselves, they're distributing food to others. And then finally looking around with a basket in our hand to be sure that nothing gets lost, even at the end of the sharing. I heard recently that society level inequality has only gone down at 3 times in U.S. history, which was right after the 2 world wars and right after the pandemic. And on a longer time scale, I was reading that inequality went way down on a society level right after the Black Death in Europe. Is it possible that we might turn the world upside down without needing catastrophe and chaos? That would be miraculous. And it is possible, and I see it happen all the time in the church. What other word than a miracle can you use for the fact that we have a relationship with a school in Haiti that is still feeding kids in Haiti today? What other than a miracle can you call it when we are giving away right now $70,000 from our capital campaign? The tithe of our capital campaign is going out to New Hampshire preschool children. It's going out to women who have stood up out of abusive relationships and stood up into themselves again. It's going out to teens without homes. It's going out to adults and families without homes. It's going out to people who are hungry for literal bread. It's going out to the diocesan campaign so that we can proclaim far and wide that all of this is not just good, but all of this is communion with the living God. So I could ask again, how do you believe that those 5,000 people were fed on the hillside? But actually, to be honest with you, I already knew a lot about what you believe about that before I asked the question, because I get to do church with you all the time. I get to have communion with you, and that expansive communion, St. John's expanded vision of what communion is. And maybe John heightened the drama of the feeding of the 5,000 to help us notice that the feeding of the 5,000 is happening in our lives too. To help us claim this sign in our lives, and to help us each time that we enter the 5,000, the feeding of the 5,000 again, to help us more and more fully fulfill this sign.